I never told my son that my monthly take-home pay was $95,000 to him and his wife. I was just a retired old woman living on a modest pension, so when his wife looked me dead in the eye and said, "Pack your bags and get out, you broke beggar," and my own son threw my luggage onto the wet driveway, I didn't argue, I didn't cry. A month later, I bought the most luxurious estate in their entire neighborhood directly across the street. When the moving truck blocked the road and they saw my name on the deed, the look on their faces was worth every single penny. Good day, dear listeners, it's Clara here, bringing you another incredible journey of resilience and quiet triumph. If you enjoy stories where justice is served cold and dignity wins, please subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and let me know in the comments below which city or country you're listening from. I love seeing how far our community reaches. Now let me tell you the story of Evelyn Bennett. I was 62 years old on the rainy Tuesday evening when my daughter-in-law Vanessa explicitly called me a financial drain on their household, and my son Julian stood by as my life's essentials were set outside on the porch. For nearly 25 years I operated as the Chief Regulatory Compliance Director for an international asset management group based out of Charlotte, North Carolina. It is a world of absolute precision and compliance. You do not guess, you audit. You do not react emotionally, you evaluate liabilities. My salary, which stabilized at $95,000 a month due to equity shares and senior bonuses, was an absolute secret, not out of shame but out of deep-seated habit. My late mother used to tell me, "Evelyn, the moment you tell people the exact weight of your purse, you give them a roadmap on how to rob you." I kept my wealth the way I kept my personal life, entirely orderly, intensely private, and exclusively mine. When my husband Arthur passed away 7 years ago from a sudden cardiac event, the silence in our family home was deafening. I poured that grief directly into my ledgers. Our only son Julian was already established. He was 34, working as a senior logistics manager for an industrial development firm. I was fiercely proud of him. He had his father's analytical mind and my stubborn streak. Then came Vanessa. Julian met her at a corporate charity gala in 2021. She was magnetic in an aggressive sort of way, loudly confident, and possessed a desperate need to appear highly intellectual and cultured. I recognized the underlying fragility of her ego immediately, but as a mother I chose to look past it. I wanted Julian to be happy. When they bought their home in the upscale Oak Ridge subdivision, I helped them paint. When they married, I quietly funded their honeymoon without making a spectacle of it. For 3 years I visited them once a month for a weekend. I brought premium groceries, tended to their overgrown rose bushes, and watched their rescue golden retriever, Barnaby, whenever they traveled. I never inquired about Julian's salary, nor did I ask Vanessa why her boutique consulting firm never seemed to have actual clients. I assumed we had a foundational respect. I was dangerously incorrect. The first shift occurred last autumn. I arrived for my monthly weekend visit and found that the small guest bedroom I usually occupied had been completely stripped. The antique oak bed was gone, replaced by a minimalist meditation mat, a neon sign that read "Manifest," and a high-end essential oil diffuser pumping lavender into the air. Vanessa didn't offer an apology. While pouring herself a green juice, she remarked, "Evelyn, I assumed you wouldn't mind the leather pull-out sofa in the den. We really needed to optimize our home's spiritual energy flow." I slept on the pull-out sofa. My spine ached, but I remained silent. The second indicator arrived 2 months later. I was retrieving my reading glasses from the corridor near the kitchen when I overheard Vanessa speaking to her sister on speakerphone. "She just occupies space, Sandra," Vanessa hissed. "She turns up every month, expects Julian to cater to her, and doesn't contribute a single dollar to the property value. She's dead weight, and Julian is too soft-hearted to drop her at a senior home." I froze in the corridor. I took a deep, measured breath, adjusted my glasses, walked past the kitchen without a glance, and returned to my book. In my line of work, you do not confront an adversary until you have fully mapped out the terrain. By the time May arrived, Vanessa's strategy had turned explicit. She began talking loudly within my earshot about spatial boundaries and the emotional toll of multi-generational stagnation. Julian would simply nod along, staring at his tablet, refusing to meet my eyes. Then came the night of May 14th. Julian had messaged me days prior. "Come down this weekend, Mom. Let's have dinner." I caught the afternoon commuter train, carrying a fresh batch of homemade minestrone soup and a compact duffel bag for a 2-night stay. When I rang the bell at 6 in the evening, Vanessa opened the door. She looked at my sensible orthopedic loafers, my simple canvas bag, and the Tupperware container in my hands. Her face hardened into an expression of chilling certainty. "Evelyn," she said, completely dropping the polite tone she usually manufactured, We aren't running a subsidized lodging house. We need our space, and we are no longer in a position to accommodate family members who offer absolutely nothing to this household. I looked over her shoulder. Julian was standing near the staircase, intently studying his smartphone. "Julian," I called out clearly. He glanced up, his face flushing a deep, guilty crimson, before looking right back down at his screen. He said absolutely nothing. Vanessa stepped out onto the porch, shutting the front door halfway behind her. "It's time for you to find alternative arrangements permanently. Evelyn, you're retired, you have a pension, go find a budget motel. We don't want a penniless old woman camped out in our living room anymore." Before I could even speak, the door clicked shut. 10 minutes later, while I stood on the porch in the gathering dusk, the door opened a crack. Julian reached out, set my duffel bag on the concrete with a dull thud, and locked the deadbolt. I stood there in the quiet North Carolina air, holding a warm container of soup, listening to the muffled sound of their surround sound television powering up inside. I didn't cause a scene. I walked to the edge of the street, called an Uber, and rode downtown to a high-end boutique hotel. But as the elevator ascended to the penthouse suite, a cold, crystalline realization washed over me. They had constructed a fictional version of me, a fragile, destitute widow dependent on their charity, and they had used that fiction to discard me. They had made a catastrophic mathematical error. And in compliance, every error requires immediate correction. But as Evelyn sat alone in her luxury suite, she didn't realize that her son's betrayal went far deeper than a locked door. What hidden scheme had Julian and Vanessa been plotting behind her back? And how would a surprise phone call from her estate attorney change everything? Stay tuned for part 2. The hotel room was pristine, overlooking the glittering skyline of Charlotte. I sat at the mahogany desk, entirely composed. For 35 years, I had analyzed high-stakes corporate fraud. I had watched billionaire executives break down under federal cross-examination. I had learned to process reality sequentially. Isolate the facts, evaluate the risk, execute the strategy. Fact: my son had abandoned his mother under the delusion that she was a financial burden. Fact: they believed I was penniless because I wore unbranded clothes and drove an 8-year-old sedan. Fact: my liquid investment portfolio alone was currently valued at $7.8 million, entirely independent of my corporate trust accounts. The emotional wound of Julian's compliance in this cruelty was a separate line item. I had bandaged his scraped knees. I had stayed awake through his childhood pneumonia. I had listened to him talk about his dreams for hours. To watch him retreat into a screen while his wife evicted me was a profound disappointment. But grief without action is simply bad management. It was a magnificent 5-bedroom traditional brick estate with an expansive wraparound veranda and a century-old oak tree anchoring the front lawn. It sat on an elevated lot. Crucially, it was positioned directly, unblinkingly, across the street from Julian and Vanessa's gray-painted house. The asking price was $1.45 million. The listing had been live for less than 48 hours. The next morning at exactly 8 a.m., I called my longtime real estate and asset attorney Beatrice Vance. Beatrice was 64, highly selective with her clientele, and possessed the emotional temperament of a stone wall. "Evelyn," Beatrice said after listening to my narrative without a single interruption, "purchasing an estate directly facing your son's driveway is either an act of psychological warfare or absolute genius. Can it not be both, Beatrice?" I replied smoothly. "When a woman with your balance sheet decides to do both, the state usually stays out of her way." Beatrice chuckled. "I will initiate the acquisition protocol through a blind corporate entity this morning." I didn't contact Julian. I knew exactly how the narrative would be spun if I called him crying or angry. I would be framed as the unstable, interfering mother-in-law trying to cause an emotional fracture in their marriage. I refused to hand them the script. I would remain a ghost until the foundation was poured. To ensure total anonymity during the transaction, Beatrice routed the purchase through a private holding company I had established a decade ago for asset distribution, Bancroft Heritage Holdings LLC. When the county recorder's office processed the pending sale, the name Evelyn Bennett appeared nowhere on the public interface. If Vanessa or Julian decided to look up the buyer of the multi-million-dollar estate across the street, they would see nothing but a sterile corporate registry. 2 weeks into the closing process, I received an unexpected phone call from my nephew Harrison, Arthur's brother's son. Harrison was an honest young man who worked in commercial banking and kept close tabs on family dynamics. "Aunt Evelyn," Harrison began, his tone laced with visible hesitation, "Julian called me yesterday. He was asking very specific questions about your financial health. He wanted to know if Dad or I had ever managed any hidden accounts for you, or if you were entirely reliant on your baseline state pension." I adjusted my telephone headset. "And what did you communicate to him, Harrison?" "I told him the truth, that you never discuss your finances with anyone," Harrison said. "But Aunt Evelyn." He asked if I thought the family would need to pool money together to put you in an assisted living facility by next year. He said you seemed disoriented and were staying in random downtown hotels. My hand tightened around my pen. Julian wasn't just justifying his cruelty. He was actively preparing a narrative to pathologize my existence. He wanted to convince the family that casting me out was a necessary step because I was losing my cognitive faculties and possessed no financial stability. "Thank you, Harrison," I said calmly. "Your disclosure has been logged." I hung up and immediately dialed Beatrice Vance. "Beatrice, retrieve my current estate plan and last will and testament. We are restructuring the primary beneficiaries before the real estate closing next week." Evelyn was about to permanently sever her son's financial future, but she didn't know that Vanessa was already preparing a legal trap of her own. What explosive document would arrive at Evelyn's hotel room, and how would it completely backfire on Julian and Vanessa at the upcoming neighborhood assembly? Don't miss part 3. By 3 p.m. that afternoon, I was seated in Beatrice Vance's executive office on the top tier of the corporate plaza. The room was lined with dark walnut paneling and smelled of expensive parchment and aged leather. We reviewed the active documents. Under the existing terms drafted 5 years ago, Julian was the sole heir to 75% of my liquid assets in real estate holdings. The remaining 25% was assigned to a specialized medical research foundation. "Strip his name entirely," I commanded without an ounce of hesitation. "Establish a private charitable foundation, the Bennett Compliance Trust. Shift all primary capital into the trust's control. Include a highly restrictive discretionary clause that requires 20 years of verified personal financial independence before any relative can even request an educational grant." Beatrice's fountain pen moved across the draft. "You understand this makes the exclusion permanent unless you explicitly execute an amendment? I spent my life verifying data, Beatrice. I do not issue bailouts to entities that actively vote for my liquidation." I signed the revised instrument on June 19th. It was the absolute point of no return. On June 28th, the funds were wired, the deeds were stamped, and Bancroft Heritage Holdings LLC officially took ownership of 714 Marrowstone Lane. I arranged for my personal belongings and high-end furniture, which had been secured in a climate-controlled executive storage facility during my apartment transition, to be delivered on a bright Saturday morning in mid-July. The moving apparatus was monumental. 2 massive, unmarked commercial transport trucks backed into the long driveway of the brick estate, completely filling the visual field of the street. I stood on the wide front porch, holding a porcelain mug of dark roast coffee, a digital tablet in my hand, wearing a tailored cream linen shirt and tailored trousers. At approximately 10:45 a.m., the front door across the street opened. Vanessa stepped onto her porch, dressed in designer yoga gear, holding a cell phone. I watched her eyes track the size of the moving trucks. Then her gaze shifted to the porch. She stopped dead in her tracks. Her head tilted forward as if trying to clear an optical illusion. She turned back toward her house and screamed, "Julian! Get out here right now!" Julian emerged onto the driveway, holding a coffee mug. Vanessa pointed a manicured finger directly across the road at me. I watched my son's body language instantly stiffen. His shoulders dropped, and his mouth literally opened in absolute disbelief. They crossed the asphalt together, their footsteps rapid and chaotic. They stopped at the edge of my manicured lawn, staring up at me as I stood on the elevated porch. "Evelyn!" Vanessa spat, her voice cracking with a mixture of confusion and intense rage. "What kind of sick, twisted game is this? What are you doing outside this house?" "Good morning, Vanessa." "Good morning, Julian." I said, my voice carrying cleanly across the lawn. I am supervising my moving team. The antique mahogany table requires very careful handling. How are you renting this place? Vanessa demanded, stepping closer. This is an executive estate. You can't afford to be within 5 miles of this block. Did you take out a predatory loan just to stalk us? I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. I did not rent this house, Vanessa. And I certainly do not possess loans. I purchased this estate with cash through my private holding firm. I have always preferred this neighborhood's tree canopy. Julian's face went completely pale. Mom, you bought this? The whole property? With what money? The money I earned every single month while you were growing up, Julian. The money I chose not to display because I wanted to raise a son who valued people, not bank balances. Clearly, that investment failed, so I reinvested in real estate instead. Vanessa's eyes flared with an ugly, defensive venom. You think you're clever? This is harassment. You bought a house directly across from our family home just to spy on us. We will file a restraining order by Monday morning. You are welcome to attempt that, Vanessa, I replied with a cold, professional smile. But as a senior compliance director, I suggest you consult a licensed attorney before you file a frivolous motion in a superior court. It saves quite a bit on legal sanctions. I turned back to the moving crew, completely dismissing them from my sight. 3 days later, an official legal envelope arrived at my door via courier. Vanessa had actually found a junior associate at a local firm to draft a formal cease and desist letter. The document alleged that my presence in the neighborhood constituted targeted psychological intimidation and threatened a civil suit if I did not immediately put the property up for sale. I scanned it, emailed it to Beatrice Vance, and went back to tending to my hydrangeas. Beatrice's response was a masterpiece of legal devastation. She issued a counter-notice detailing my lawful acquisition of the property, attached a copy of my active corporate credentials, and explicitly stated that any attempt to file a restriction would result in an immediate countersuit for civil defamation and full recovery of all corporate defense fees. The junior associate withdrew from the matter within 48 hours. But Vanessa wasn't finished. If she couldn't use the courts to remove me, she decided to use the community itself as a weapon. Vanessa was about to launch a whisper campaign, designed to totally ruin Evelyn's reputation among her new neighbors. But she had no idea that Evelyn had already joined forces with the most powerful group in the neighborhood. Who would survive the ultimate showdown at the town hall meeting? Find out in part 4. A neighborhood is like any corporation. It runs on communication networks, and if you don't manage those networks, someone else will inject toxic data into them. My immediate neighbor to the left was Martha Greenfield, a sharp-witted 68-year-old retired literature professor who had lived in Oak Ridge for over 2 decades. Martha was the unofficial heart of the community's cultural circle. We met over the garden fence when I noticed her struggling with a complex irrigation line. Having spent decades analyzing structural systems, I fixed it for her in 10 minutes. We quickly developed a deep mutual respect. Within a week, Martha invited me to the monthly Oak Ridge Resident Alliance Assembly, which was held in the community wing of the regional library. On the Monday before the scheduled meeting, my nephew Harrison called me again. Aunt Evelyn, Vanessa is unhinged, he warned. She's been joining the local neighborhood digital forums and sending private messages to homeowners on your street. She's telling everyone that you have advanced cognitive decline, that you became obsessed with her and Julian, and that you used your husband's old life insurance to buy the house across from them out of pure spite. She's trying to get the Neighborhood Alliance to vote you out for violating community safety standards. An fascinating strategy, I remarked, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. She is attempting to manufacture a social quarantine. Thank you, Harrison. Ensure you preserve copies of all those text messages. I spent the next 2 days gathering documentation. In my career, you never enter an audit without the receipts. On Thursday evening, I dressed in my finest corporate attire. A sharp charcoal wool power suit by a luxury British designer, my hair perfectly coiffed, and an elegant leather briefcase in hand. I looked every bit the high-ranking financial executive I was. When I entered the library assembly room, there were about 25 neighbors seated in rows. Martha Greenfield smiled and saved a seat for me near the front. For minutes after the session was called to order, Julian and Vanessa walked in. Vanessa was dressed impeccably, her face a mask of practiced concern. Julian followed behind her, his eyes anchored to the floor, looking like a man marching to an execution. The meeting moved through standard neighborhood business, road resurfacing budgets, park maintenance, and lighting schedules. Then, during the open floor segment, Vanessa raised her hand. The board chair recognized her. Vanessa stood up, smoothing her skirt, and adopted a tone of trembling manufactured vulnerability. "Thank you, board," Vanessa began, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "My name is Vanessa Bennett, and my husband Julian and I have lived on Marrowstone Lane for 3 years. We love this community because it feels safe. But recently that safety has been compromised. A relative of ours with severe, unmanaged psychological and mental challenges has purchased the estate directly across from us. This individual has been targeting our household, tracking our movements, and creating an intensely hostile environment. We have attempted to handle this privately, but we are deeply concerned for the emotional and physical safety of this entire block. We believe the board should review her property occupancy status." A quiet murmur rippled through the back rows. Vanessa looked down at me, a tiny triumphant smirk flashing across her lips. The board chair looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Bennett, this board does not typically arbitrate private family disputes unless there is a clear violation of city codes or safety bylaws. Is the homeowner present?" I stood up slowly. I didn't rush. I unbuttoned my blazer, stepped out into the central aisle, and turned to face the entire room. The sheer presence of my professional authority instantly brought the room to a total dead silence. "Good evening, board, and good evening to my neighbors," I said, my voice steady, resonant, and completely devoid of emotional anger. "My name is Evelyn Bennett. I am the lawful owner of 714 Marrowstone Lane. I am also the active Chief Regulatory Compliance Director for an international asset management firm, controlling over $300 million in institutional capital. I am not retired, nor do I suffer from any cognitive impairment." I opened my briefcase and pulled out 3 neatly organized, color-coded packets. "I believe in total transparency and verified data," I continued, handing the packets to the board members. "Inside these documents you will find my current corporate employment credentials, a certified mental fitness evaluation conducted annually for executive insurance compliance, and a notarized timeline of events. On May 14th of this year, my daughter-in-law explicitly evicted me from her home under the false impression that I was destitute. I chose to purchase my new estate on the open market using my own liquid cash reserves. Furthermore, I have attached verified transcripts of private messages sent by Vanessa Bennett to members of this room, which constitute actionable civil defamation per se under North Carolina law." The room went completely breathless. The board chair stared at the documents, his eyebrows rising rapidly. I turned my head slowly and looked directly at Vanessa. Her face had drained of all color. Her mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water. I looked down at Julian. He had buried his face entirely in his hands. "I have not trespassed," I concluded clearly. "I have not engaged in surveillance. I am simply a corporate executive living in a house I paid for. If any individual in this room wishes to review my financial or legal standing further, my attorney Beatrice Vance is available for consultation. Thank you." I sat back down next to Martha, who was quietly grinning from ear to ear. The board chair cleared his throat loudly. "Thank you, Mrs. Bennett. The documentation is indisputable. Mrs. Vanessa Bennett, this board strongly advises you to cease utilizing public community forums for private personal grievances. We are moving on to the next item on the agenda." Vanessa sank back into her chair, as if she had been physically struck. Julian didn't look at her for the remainder of the evening. But the true collapse of their house of cards didn't happen in that meeting room. It happened inside their own bank accounts. Evelyn had completely crushed Vanessa's social warfare, but the true reckoning was about to begin. What dark financial secret were Julian and Vanessa hiding from the world? And how did a secret text message from Julian in the middle of the night signal the total destruction of their marriage? Stay tuned for part 5. 3 weeks after the neighborhood assembly, Beatrice Vance requested an end-of-month meeting at her office. "Evelyn, while preparing our potential defamation filing against Vanessa, I ran a routine financial asset search on your son and his wife to assess their capacity to pay damages, Beatrice said, sliding a financial summary sheet across the glass table. The data is quite illuminating. I put on my reading glasses and scanned the columns. In compliance, you learn to read between the numbers to find the panic. Julian and Vanessa were on the absolute brink of total financial collapse. They had purchased their Oak Ridge home 3 years ago at the absolute limit of Julian's borrowing capacity. Vanessa's boutique consulting firm was a total ghost operation. It had generated zero net revenue over the last 12 months, while burning through thousands in digital advertising. Worse, they had racked up $85,000 in high-interest credit card debt to fund the white and gold living room remodel and the luxury European vacations Vanessa routinely uploaded to her social media accounts. Most critically, 3 weeks prior, their application to refinance their mortgage had been completely denied due to a disastrous debt-to-income ratio. They were currently 3 months away from defaulting on their primary property loan. I took off my glasses. They threw me out because they were suffocating in debt, and they genuinely believed my monthly visits were draining their grocery resources. And, Beatrice added, they were likely hoping that if they convinced the family you were incompetent, they could gain power of attorney over whatever remaining savings you had left to clear their balances. I looked out the window at the Charlotte skyline. It was the classic anatomy of a modern fraud, prioritizing appearance over stability, and treating family as a resource to be harvested rather than protected. I returned to my estate that afternoon. I sat at my mahogany desk and wrote a letter to Julian. I wrote it by hand, using premium stationery. It was not an act of malice. It was an audit report from a mother to her child. Julian, I am aware of the mortgage refinancing denial. I am also aware of your current credit liabilities. When I adjusted my estate documents in June, removing you as an heir, it was not an act of vengeance. It was an act of asset protection. I will not allow capital I secured through decades of discipline to be consumed by a lifestyle built on vanity and financial deceit. You stood in your hallway and allowed your wife to cast me out because it was easier to succumb to her volume than to stand for the truth. You allowed her to attack my sanity before our neighbors because you were too weak to stop her. I will not be selling my house on Marrowstone Lane. I will continue to live my life with total visibility. I love you with the deep, aching complexity of a mother who has been deeply disappointed by her child. If you ever wish to sit at my table and speak the absolute truth, without an agenda, without Vanessa's scripts, and without asking for a financial bailout, I will make coffee and I will listen. Your mother, Evelyn. I walked across the street that evening, slipped the envelope directly through the mail slot of their dark gray front door, and watched it slide onto their hardwood floor. 2 days later, their attorney Brett Hollis sent a frantic notice alleging the letter was unwanted contact. Beatrice Vance filed a reply within 60 minutes containing the full asset report, and a note stating that if they didn't cease, we would immediately notify their primary mortgage lenders of their fraudulent misrepresentations regarding Vanessa's business income. The threats stopped instantly. For 3 months, the street was entirely quiet. I lived my life fully. I hosted the local garden club on my veranda. I published a major regulatory article in an international compliance journal. I attended evening lectures at the university. I was thoroughly content. Across the street, the gray house seemed to dim. Vanessa's luxury SUV was repossessed in late October, replaced by a battered compact rental. The loud arguments inside their house could occasionally be heard over the lawn on quiet nights. Then, on a freezing Sunday evening in early January, my phone lit up. It was a text message from Julian. Mom, can I please come over? Alone. The final reckoning had arrived at Evelyn's kitchen table. What devastating confession would Julian make through his tears? And how would Evelyn's ultimate act of strength completely reshape their family's future forever? Stay tuned for the final part. The grandfather clock in my hallway chimed 8 p.m. when the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Julian standing on the porch. He wasn't wearing his usual sharp corporate outerwear. He was in a faded sweatshirt, his eyes heavily bloodshot, his face lined with an exhaustion that went deep into his bones. Come in, I said quietly. He sat at my kitchen table, the very same table I had refinished with my own hands 30 years ago. I set a mug of hot black coffee in front of him and sliced a piece of fresh lemon pound cake. For the first 20 minutes, Julian just wept. He wept with the heavy, unglamorous breaking of a man who had realized the total collapse of his choices. "Vanessa is moving out," he whispered finally, his hands trembling around the mug. "She filed for divorce 2 days ago when I refused to ask you for a loan to save the house. She called me a failure, Mom. She told me she only married me because she thought the Bennett family had millions hidden away that she could use to launch her brand." I remained silent, letting the facts settle in the room. "I knew what she was doing was wrong," Julian choked out, looking up at me, his eyes full of raw agony. "When she threw your bag out in May, I felt sick to my stomach. But I was so terrified of her leaving me, so terrified of admitting that my life was falling apart, that I just let myself become a monster. When I called Harrison to check on your money, I was desperate, Mom. I was looking for a lifeline, and I let her convince me that you were the problem. I don't want your money, Mom," he sobbed, reaching across the table, his fingers stopping just short of my hand. "I don't care if I lose the house. I don't care if I have to declare bankruptcy. I miss my mother. I want to earn your respect back, even if it takes me the rest of my life." I looked at my son. I didn't see the weak man who had stood in the hallway in May. I saw the boy I had raised, finally stripped of the vanity that had blinded him. In compliance, when an asset has depreciated completely, but the core structure is salvageable, you do not discard it. You restructure. The path back to integrity is entirely unglamorous, Julian, I told him firmly. You will let the house go into foreclosure if necessary. You will pay off your liabilities through disciplined budgeting. You will secure a modest apartment, and you will work your shifts with absolute focus. And every Sunday evening you will walk across this street, you will sit at this table, and you will report your progress to me. He wiped his face, a genuine relieved smile breaking through his tears. I will, Mom. I swear I will. The transition was arduous. Over the next 4 months, the gray house across the street went up for sale, was purchased by a lovely young family with 2 toddlers, and was painted a warm, bright cream color. Julian moved into a clean, minimalist 1-bedroom apartment downtown. He cut up his credit cards and initiated a strict debt management protocol. He came over every single Sunday. We didn't talk about wealth. We talked about his logistics firm. We talked about memories of his father, Arthur. We talked about the books we were reading. Slowly, the thick artificial armor that had separated us for years melted away. Vanessa disappeared from our lives entirely, moving back to her home state to pursue another target for her lifestyle dreams. Her social media channels went entirely dark. Spring arrived in North Carolina with a sudden magnificent burst of warmth. The old oak tree on my front lawn sprouted deep green leaves, and the long row of hydrangeas along my south fence line, which had been severely neglected by the previous owner, bloomed into an extraordinary canopy of deep, vivid lavender blue. Martha Greenfield came over to my fence on a bright Saturday morning in early May, holding a pair of pruning shears. She looked at the expansive, beautiful estate, then at me as I sat on my veranda reading a biography of an economic historian. Evelyn, you look absolutely, completely settled, Martha called out with a warm smile. I looked across the clean, quiet street at the cream-colored house, then down at the beautiful blue flowers framing my property line. I felt the deep, unshakable weight of my own autonomy, my own family restored on the foundations of absolute truth. Yes, Martha, I replied, raising my coffee mug in a quiet toast to the morning sky. Settled. That is exactly the word.